Welcome to Dark Diaries, where we unearth the forgotten and harrowing tales from the shadows of history. The past is filled with stories of injustice, but tonight we journey back to a time of profound darkness, to a Christmas Eve that was stained not with festive cheer, but with the blood of vengeance. This is the story of a debt that could only be paid in kind. Colonel William Bowman screamed when he saw Samuel tearing the clothes off his wife. It was Christmas Eve, 1855, and the Bowman's plantation house in Beaufort County, Mississippi was witnessing a revenge that would forever upend the order of things. The cold December wind blew in through the open windows, carrying the scent of magnolia that Eleanor so loved. "Now you'll see how it feels," Colonel Samuel said, holding Mrs. Eleanor by the hair as she wept. "You're going to watch your wife the same way I watched my Sarah." 3 days earlier, Mrs. B. Eleanor had ordered the colonel to have the overseers raped Sarah before Samuel's eyes, forcing him to watch as 2 foremen held him with rough ropes that cut his wrist to the bone. "Please, Samuel," the colonel shouted, trying to free himself from the chair he was tied to. She didn't know what she was doing. It was a moment of madness. "Yes, she did," Samuel said, pushing Mrs. Eleanor onto the dining table set for the Christmas feast. She knew very well. And now she's going to pay for every second of the suffering she caused. The table was set with the French porcelain the family used on grand occasions, silver plates bearing the family crest, crystal glasses imported from England, pure wax candles that cost more than a slave. Everything that symbolized the Bowman's power would now witness their complete humiliation. "My God, what have you done to him?" Mrs. Eleanor tried to shield herself with trembling hands. "William helped me make him stop," but the colonel could only watch, tied up like an animal for slaughter, just as Samuel had been forced to watch Sarah 3 days before. The ropes that bound him were the same ones used to tie up runaway slaves. "Did you think I would forget?" Samuel tore the green French silk dress that had cost a fortune. "Did you think a black man has no feelings, no dignity, no heart?" Each word came out slowly, calculated, as if savoring a revenge that had been anticipated for 15 years of silent servitude. 15 years of swallowing humiliations, witnessing injustices, storing every offense in his memory. "Sarah cried just the way you're crying now," Samuel continued, his eyes reflecting the candle light. "But no one stopped when she begged. No one had mercy on her." In the adjoining room, the grand piano remained open to the music. Mrs. Bill Eleanor had played the night before, a romantic waltz by Strauss that now sounded like a funeral march in the colonel's head. The notes seemed to echo like a lament for the dead. "I was always loyal," William shouted, cold sweat running down his face. "I always treated you well. I gave you privileges no other slave had." "Lies." Samuel turned his face to him, showing the old scars on his neck. "You used me as a whip against my own people. You made me beat innocent children. You forced me to whip a pregnant woman until she lost her child." The truth hurt more than the ropes cutting into the colonel's wrists. He knew he had turned Samuel into a monster just like himself, forged in cruelty and tempered by suffering. "And when your wife wanted to destroy my Sarah," Samuel turned his attention back to Mrs. Eleanor, who was trembling like a leaf in the wind. "You obeyed without hesitation, without question, without a thought." The fire in the hearth crackled, illuminating the tears streaming down the mistress's face, the same tears Sarah had shed 3 days earlier when she begged for a mercy that never came. "Please," Mrs. Eleanor whispered, her voice from crying. "I have small children. They need their mother." "Sarah could have had children too," Samuel replied, his voice heavy with ancestral pain. "But you ended that possibility. You killed not only her but all the children we could have had." On the dining table decorated for Christmas, every one of Mrs. Eleanor's tears paid back the humiliation that had burned in Samuel's soul like a branding iron. Every moan echoed Sarah's ignored pleas. "You ordered the overseers to do this to my wife," Samuel repeated with every movement, his voice rising in intensity. "You said it was to teach her her place. Now you will feel on your own skin what you ordered for Sarah." The candles on the table flickered in the cold wind coming through the windows, creating dancing shadows on the walls. It was as if the spirits of the dead slaves had come to witness the revenge. And when Samuel was finished, when the dignity of the big house was crushed, just as the dignity of the slave quarters had been crushed, he whispered in the colonel's ear, "Now you know what it's like to be someone's property, what it's like to have no rights, no voice, no humanity." The revenge was just beginning, and this was only the first night of a debt that would take a long time to be settled. The year is 1855, Boxford County, Mississippi. The Boer plantation stretched for 10,000 acres across the fertile floodplains of the Mississippi River. It was the largest cotton plantation in the region, where 300 slaves toiled under the relentless command of Colonel William Beaumont, a man of 52 known for his blind obedience to his wife, and for the brutal methods of discipline that made his plantation feared throughout the state. His graying beard barely concealed the smallpox scars that had disfigured his face since youth, giving him an even more sinister appearance. 40 lashes, he would always say with the same calculated coldness. And if he faints, wait for him to wake up to continue. I want him to learn the lesson properly. The colonel had inherited not only his father's land, but also his refined cruelty. He believed that slaves only obeyed out of fear, and he made sure to keep that fear alive through exemplary punishments that echoed throughout the slave quarters. Samuel, 38 years old, had been the head overseer for 15 years. His enormous hands knew both the handle of the whip and the workings of the cotton gin. Tall, strong, with broad shoulders that carried not only cotton, but also the weight of being the colonel's right-hand man in all his cruelties. "You're different from the others, Samuel," the colonel would always say while smoking his Cuban cigar. "You have intelligence. You have strength. That's why I trust you to maintain order." The cruel paradox of slavery. The slave who punished other slaves. The man who had to choose daily between being a victim or a tormentor, knowing that any hesitation could cost him his own life. Married to Sarah, a housemaid in the big house, Samuel had built the dangerous illusion that his loyalty and efficiency would protect them from their master's excesses. He believed that by being too useful to be discarded, he would have some protection. Sarah, a woman with skin as light as coffee with milk and delicate features that resembled a porcelain doll, had served the Bowman family since she was a girl. Her curly hair was always tied in a perfect bun. Her almond-shaped eyes smiled even on the most difficult days, as if they held a secret of hope. An orphan since the age of 5, when her parents died of yellow fever, she had been raised in the big house. Almost like an adopted daughter, she had learned to read in secret, listening to the lessons of the colonel's children, and she spoke with an education that deeply irritated Mrs. Eleanor. But she always aroused Mrs. Eleanor's sick and irrational jealousy. The mistress saw in the slave's beauty a constant threat to her position. She imagined that her husband secretly desired her, that guests praised her too much, that she thought herself superior to the other slaves because of her appearance and education. "That thinks she's too pretty," Mrs. Eleanor would murmur to her friends during soirees. "She thinks she's our equal. One day I'll show her her place once and for all." The couple lived in a separate cabin in the yard, a privilege few slaves on the plantation had. 2 small but clean rooms with a window overlooking the orchard. But it was a palace compared to the overcrowded slave quarters where dozens of people slept on the dirt floor, a privilege that would become a deadly curse when it finally awakened the murderous envy of the big house. The routine at Buford Plantation began at 4 in the morning when the chapel bell woke all the slaves for another day of grueling work. Samuel would get up first, light the oil lamp, and wake Sarah with a loving kiss on her sweaty forehead. "Good morning, my love," she would whisper, stretching her arms like a lazy cat. "Good morning, my beautiful girl," he would reply, admiring for a moment the woman who was his only joy in that hell. Precious moments of tenderness that contrasted dramatically with the brutality that awaited them throughout the day. Small oases of humanity in a desert of cruelty. Mrs. Eleanor, a 29-year-old woman with blonde hair, always styled in elaborate uppity cotton barrens from Georgia. She had brought to the marriage not only a generous dowry, but also a refined cruelty that manifested itself especially against the most beautiful female slaves, as if she wanted to destroy any beauty that might outshine her own. William, she would always call her husband in a honeyed voice that concealed poison. I need to talk to you about the discipline of the female slaves. They've been very insolent lately, and the colonel would obey without question, like a well-trained dog. Mrs. Eleanor's power over her husband was absolute and inexplicable. A word from her became an immediate order. A whim turned into an unassailable law. A look of displeasure was enough to sentence someone to death. That Sarah is getting too bold, she would sometimes say, for no apparent reason. She looks at you too much when she serves the coffee. I think she's forgetting her place. Lies she carefully planted to justify future cruelties she was already planning in her disturbed mind. The slaves at Beaufort knew from experience that Mrs. Eyeliner was more dangerous than the colonel himself. He punished for discipline, following a twisted but predictable logic. She tortured for pure pleasure with no logic or limit. Watch out for the mistress. They warned each other in cautious whispers. She smiles when she hits. She likes to see blood. She's the devil in a dress. In the large slave quarters, where the other slaves live crowded together. The stories repeated every night like a litany of suffering. Children who were beaten until they passed out. Women raped by the overseers. Men branded with hot iron for non-existent crimes. One day this will change. Someone would always whisper in the pre-dawn darkness. When another would ask, their voice full of despair. When God wills it, the oldest would invariably reply, or when we can't take it anymore. But God seemed deaf to the screams that came from the plantation every night. Hakim, a 14-year-old boy with eyes still full of hope, dropped a wooden bowl. The colonel ordered 50 lashes as an exemplary punishment. Haim didn't survive the first 20. He was buried in a shallow grave, without a priest, without a prayer, without a name on the rough wooden cross. He was just a boy, a low voice said in the slave quarters that night. Samuel kept that heavy silence like a sharp knife in his heart. Mary of Sorrows, a 16-year-old slave with the round belly of advanced pregnancy, became pregnant by one of the overseers. Mrs. Eleanor ordered her to work in the cotton fields until she went into labor, carrying heavy loads of cotton under the scorching sun. The girl died among the cotton plants along with her child, her blood mixing with the red earth. That was my granddaughter, cried the grandmother, old Antonia, who had raised the girl since she was little. Another silence, laden with pain that Samuel stored away as ammunition for the future. Peter, a 40-year-old man who had lost a leg in a gin years before, broke his remaining arm falling from a ladder. Mrs. Eleanor forbade him from stopping work, forcing him to carry cotton with his broken arm dangling. Is good for something, she would say, laughing like a hyena. Otherwise, he's just dead weight. Peter died of gangrene 3 weeks later, delirious with fever and calling for his mother. And Samuel kept every injustice, every scream, every death like beads on a rosary of revenge that would one day be recited in full. Why don't you do something? Sarah asked him once after seeing a child beaten until he bled. You have power here. They listen to you. What power? He replied with a bitterness that stung his throat. I'm a slave too, a slave with a whip in his hand, but a slave nonetheless. But they trust you. They trust in using me. Samuel corrected, his voice filled with self-loathing. The day I turn against them, I'll be rendered down like the others. I have no illusions. Sarah didn't insist at that moment, but she planted a seed that would germinate slowly like a poisonous plant. One day you'll have to choose, she said, her voice soft but prophetic, between being one of them or one of us, between being a tormentor or a man. The words echoed in Samuel's head for weeks like a bell ringing in the wind. They didn't know that Christmas 1855 was only 3 weeks away. 3 weeks that would change not only their lives but the entire history of the region forever. December 21st, 1855, a Tuesday morning that dawned with a bad omen. Sarah woke up with a bad feeling weighing on her chest like a stone. The sky was heavy with dark clouds that heralded a storm, and the cold wind brought the smell of rain and misfortune. "Good morning, ma'am," Sarah greeted as she entered the dining room, trying to hide the unease that gnawed at her from within. Mrs. Eleanor didn't even respond to the greeting. She flipped through a French magazine with a bored and superior air, as if the slave's presence were a personal offense. The colonel was reading the court newspaper, smoking a Cuban cigar, oblivious to the tension hanging in the air. "Serve the coffee," she ordered curtly without looking up from the magazine. Sarah picked up the ornate silver coffee pot, brought the delicate porcelain cups, and began to serve with her usual care. The Belgian lace tablecloth, imported directly from Brussels for a fortune, covered the mahogany table like a white shroud. It was the tablecloth Mrs. Zeliner prized most in the entire house, a wedding gift from a baroness aunt. It represented her status and refinement. It was worth more than the lives of 10 slaves. "Be careful," Mrs. Eleanor warned without looking up from the magazine, but with a cutting coldness in her voice. "That tablecloth is worth more than you and all your descendants combined." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah murmured, feeling her hands tremble imperceptibly. The colonel reached out his right hand to grab the crystal sugar bowl. Sarah moved gracefully to facilitate his access, as she had done thousands of times before, but this time the colonel's elbow, in a fatal fraction of a second, bumped the side of the coffee pot. The hot coffee spread across the tablecloth like blood in a battle, staining the immaculate white lace with a dark liquid that seemed to profane something sacred. A deadly silence filled the room. Mrs. Eleanor slowly raised her eyes from the magazine like a venomous snake preparing to strike. Her blue eyes shone with a dangerous light that Sarah knew well. "What have you done, you wench?" she asked in a dangerously low voice, each word dripping with pure poison. "It was an accident, ma'am." Sarah tried desperately to clean the stain with her apron, her hands visibly shaking. The colonel accidentally bumped the coffee pot. "You shameless liar." Mrs. Eleanor jumped up, knocking over her chair. "You spilled it on purpose. I always knew you were a rebellious slave." "No, ma'am. By the Virgin Mary, I swear I didn't." Sarah knelt on the cold floor, tears beginning to stream down her face. "Please believe me. I would never do that." The colonel watched the scene without saying a word. He knew perfectly well that it had been entirely his fault, but he would never contradict his wife, especially when she was in this state of fury. He knew so well. "William," Mrs. Eleanor turned to her husband, her eyes gleaming with sick malice. "This has been getting too bold for a while now. She needs to learn her place once and for all, or she'll contaminate the others. It was a tiny mistake, an insignificant accident, but Mrs. Eleanor saw in it the perfect opportunity she had been waiting for months. The chance to definitively destroy the slave who bothered her so much with her beauty and education. "What punishment do you want me to order my flour?" the colonel asked, already knowing he wouldn't like the answer. The words that came out of Mrs. Eleanor's mouth would have frozen the blood of anyone with a shred of humanity left in their soul. "Have the overseers do to her the same thing you do to me in bed," she said with a cruel smile that deformed her beautiful face in front of her husband. "So she learns once and for all that a slave's wife has no rights to anything, not even her own body." Sarah felt the floor give way beneath her. She knew exactly what the mistress was ordering, and the horror of the situation hit her like a lightning bolt from a clear sky. "Please, ma'am," she begged on her knees, her hands clasped as if in prayer. "I have a husband. I'm a married woman before God. I have honor. Slaves don't marry." Mrs. Eleanor cut her off with refined cruelty. "Slaves couple like animals in a pasture, and animals have no rights, no honor, nothing. They're just meat to be used." The colonel obeyed without question, as he always did when his wife gave orders. 20 years of marriage had turned him into her puppet. "Call Samuel," he ordered the servants waiting in the kitchen, and the overseers John the Rogue and Peter the Whip. "Tell them it's urgent." Sarah tried to get up and run, but 2 house slaves held her by the arms. The mistress's order was absolute law, even when it went against all human instincts. Samuel came running across the yard, thinking there was some emergency in the cotton fields or a problem with the machinery. When he saw Sarah being held in tears and the look of pure hatred on the mistress's face, he understood immediately that something terrible was about to happen. "What happened?" he asked, breathing heavily, his heart already racing. "Your wife has disrespected this house and this family," the colonel declared in a solemn voice as if he were a judge. "She purposely spilled coffee on my wife's wedding tablecloth, an act of rebellion that cannot go unpunished." "It was an accident, Colonel," Samuel defended desperately. "Sarah would never do something like that. She's obedient. She's always been a good slave." "It was not an accident," Mrs. Eleanor interrupted, her voice as sharp as a razor. "It was calculated disrespect, and disrespect must be punished in equal measure to serve as an example." The overseers arrived quickly, John the Rogue and Peter the Whip, brutal men who carried out tortures as if they were killing chickens for dinner without feeling a remorse. "Tie him to the porch columns," the colonel ordered, pointing at Samuel. "Tie him tight so he can't escape. Colonel, for the love of God and the Virgin Mary." Samuel tried to resist in desperation. "Sarah doesn't deserve this. She's a good slave. She's always served this house well." "A good slave doesn't spill coffee on her mistress's tablecloth," Mrs. Eleanor retorted, savoring every word. "And a slave's husband watches silently what his masters decide to do." 4 strong men held Samuel as he struggled like a caged animal. Thick hemp ropes tied his arms to the porch columns, cutting his skin until it bled. They forced him to watch as they dragged Sarah to the center of the yard as if it were a spectacle. "Now you'll learn." "Mrs. Bra," Eleanor said to Sarah, her voice as sweet as poisoned honey. "What happens to a slave who thinks she's equal to her mistress?" In front of her immobilized husband, and under the eyes of all the other slaves who were forced to watch, the 2 overseers raped Sarah for 2 endless hours, following every sadistic instruction that Mrs. Eleanor gave from the porch like a director of a makeup play. "This will teach her that she's just property," the mistress repeated as Samuel bled from his wrists, desperately trying to free himself from the ropes. "Property to be used as one pleases." "Stop, for Christ's sake, stop it," Samuel shouted, his voice from screaming. "She's my wife. My wife." But no one stopped. The colonel watched, smoking his cigar as if he were watching any other spectacle. Mrs. Eleanor smiled as if she were watching her favorite play. Sarah stopped screaming after the first hour. Her eyes no longer saw anything of this world. Her body moved like a broken doll, but her soul had gone to a place where pain could not reach. "Enough," Mrs. Eleanor finally said when she tired of the spectacle. "I think the lesson has been well learned by all." When the ropes finally fell, Samuel ran to his wife like a madman. He picked her up in his arms with infinite care, felt her cold body despite the heat, saw her eyes lost in the void. "Sarah," he whispered with a broken voice. "My love, talk to me. Please say something." She looked at him as if she didn't recognize her own husband. Her mouth moved slowly, but no sound came out. It was as if she had forgotten how to speak. Samuel carried Sarah to their small cabin, as if he were carrying his own wounded heart. He laid her on the bed with clean sheets, covered her carefully, brought fresh water, washed the blood with infinite tenderness, and made an herbal tea her mother had taught him. "You're going to be okay," he repeated like a prayer. "I'll take care of you. No one will ever hurt you again." But Sarah didn't answer. For 3 days she lay there staring at the thatched ceiling as if searching for something that was no longer there. She didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't speak, didn't cry. In the early morning of the 3rd day she finally opened her mouth for the first and last time. "Samuel," she whispered with a ghostly voice that came from another world. "I'm here, my love." He took her cold hand and held it as if he could warm it. "Will you avenge me?" she asked, her eyes finally focusing on his face. Samuel felt his heart break into 1,000 pieces. "I will," he promised, his voice choked with emotion. "By all that is sacred and by our souls, I will. Then I can go in peace," Sarah murmured with a faint smile, and she closed her eyes forever, taking with her the last spark of humanity that remained in Samuel. Samuel held the cold hand of the woman he loved until the sun rose. The man he had been died at that moment along with her. What was born in his place was pure distilled vengeance in human form. It was Christmas Eve, and Samuel already knew exactly what he was going to do. December 24th, 1855. The Christmas Eve that would be remembered for generations. Samuel woke up before the chapel bell even rang, as if an internal clock of revenge had awakened him. The empty cabin still held Sarah's sweet scent mixed with the aroma of the flowers she grew by the window. "Today is the day," he murmured, kissing the simple ring she wore, an iron ring he had forged himself. "Today they will pay for every tear, every drop of blood." Samuel feigned normality throughout the morning, playing the role of the obedient slave one last time. He commanded the work at the cotton gin with his usual efficiency, assigned tasks to the field slaves, and solved minor problems. No one suspected that inside he was seething with a hatred that had been concentrating for 3 days of planning. "How are you feeling, Samuel?" asked Hakim, one of the older slaves. "We all feel very sorry for Sarah." "I'm fine," Samuel lied perfectly. "Sarah is resting in a better place now. She was too good for this world," Hakim said, shaking his head. "She was," Samuel agreed, his eyes shining with a dangerous light. "But those who killed her will also find their place. Everyone will go where they deserve." In the afternoon, the Beaumont family prepared for the traditional Christmas dinner with their usual excitement. Mrs. Zellener wore the red velvet dress embroidered with real gold thread imported directly from Paris. The colonel put on his full military uniform with all the gleaming medals he had won in campaigns against runaway slaves. "What a wonderful Christmas," Mrs. Zellener commented, adjusting her hair in the mirror. "Everything is perfect, everything in its proper place." "Thank God," the colonel replied, adjusting his uniform and to our firmness with the slaves. "Strict discipline is the foundation of everything." They didn't even remember Sarah or what they had done. For them, it had been just another educational episode, a necessary lesson that was already forgotten. Life on the plantation continued as normal. But Samuel remembered every detail with crystal clarity, every tear, every moan, every cry for help that was coldly ignored. Every second of that torture was etched in his memory like a branding iron. "The table looks beautiful, Mrs." Eleanor said, admiring the elaborate Christmas decorations. The French porcelain, the English silverware, the pure wax candles, all gleaming as they should. The same table where Sarah had served so many meals with silent dedication, where she had spilled the coffee that cost her her life and her honor, where justice would now be served. "I'll get the wine," the colonel announced with satisfaction. "That 1,840 Bordeaux I've been saving for special occasions. It deserves to be opened today." Samuel watched everything from the kitchen window like a hunter studying his prey. Every movement, every detail, every word was mentally noted. The plan had been maturing in his head for 3 days, perfected in every detail. "John the Rogue," he called to the overseer who had raped his wife, keeping his voice neutral. "What is it, Samuel?" the brute replied, wiping his dirty hands on his shirt. "The colonel wants to talk to you and Peter in the big house." Samuel lied perfectly. Something about organizing tomorrow's festivities. "Now," John complained, yawning, "I'm dead tired, Christmas Eve and all." "An order is an order," Samuel said coldly, his eyes revealing nothing. "You know how the colonel gets when you don't obey quickly." The 2 overseers headed to the big house without suspecting a thing. They didn't know they were walking to their own deaths like animals to the slaughterhouse. Samuel waited for them to enter the house completely, then followed silently through the kitchen door. He knew every creaking floorboard, every noisy step, every dark corridor. 15 years of servitude had its deadly advantages. In the dining room, the family was chatting excitedly about their plans for the coming year. The colonel opened the expensive wine, and Mrs. Eleanor was arranging the final details of the table with obsessive perfection. "Good of you to come quickly," the colonel said to the overseers with a satisfied smile. "I wanted to personally thank you for the excellent work with that rebellious slave." "It was a pleasure, Colonel." John the Rogue laughed, showing his rotten teeth. A sassy woman has to learn the hard way. It's the only language they understand. Exactly. Peter the Whip agreed with a sinister laugh. And her husband learned not to meddle where he doesn't belong. Samuel heard every word hidden behind the door, each comment feeding the fire that burned in his chest like a furnace. The anger rose like a high tide, threatening to overflow. "Sit with us," Mrs. Eleanor invited graciously. "Let's toast to Christmas and to discipline well applied." The overseers sat down, flattered by the unprecedented attention. They were rarely invited to the table in the big house. They usually ate in the kitchen with the other servants. It was at that exact moment that Samuel made his entrance, silent as a jaguar in the dense jungle, deadly as a coral snake. In his hands he carried the colonel's own hunting rifle, loaded with 2 cartridges. "Nobody move," he said, appearing at the door of the room like an apparition. The silence was instantaneous and absolute. Everyone froze with their glasses in the air as if time had stopped. The wine stopped bubbling. The candles stopped flickering. "Samuel!" the colonel shouted, recovering from the shock. "What do you think you're doing? Have you lost your mind?" "I'm collecting a debt you've forgotten," Samuel replied, pointing the gun firmly. "A debt of blood and tears." Mrs. Eleanor dropped her glass from her trembling hand. The red wine spread across the white tablecloth like blood on a shroud, a prophecy of what was to come. "Have you gone completely mad?" she asked in a trembling voice, still trying to maintain her authority. A slave does not point a gun at his masters. "Mad?" Samuel laughed with a bitterness that cut the air. "Perhaps, but it was you who drove me mad, you who turned me into this." John the Rogue tried to stand up slowly, calculating his chances of disarming Samuel. But Samuel moved the barrel in his direction with deadly precision. "Sit down and stay quiet," he ordered with murderous coldness. "Your turn hasn't come yet, but it will." The overseer obeyed immediately, cold sweat running down his forehead. Samuel forced the colonel to tie himself to the chair at the head of the table, the same chair where he presided over family meals, where he made all the decisions about the life and death of the slaves. "Now you're going to watch everything," Samuel said, personally tightening the ropes until they hurt. "The same way you forced me to watch Sarah be destroyed." "Watch what?" the colonel asked, his voice choked, already knowing the answer and dreading it. "Your wife being treated exactly as you treated mine." Mrs. Eleanor tried to run desperately to the bedroom, but Samuel grabbed her arm with irresistible force. The strength of 15 years of carrying cotton was impossible to overcome. "Sit there," he ordered, pushing her unceremoniously into a chair. "And be very quiet, because the show is about to begin." "Samuel, for the love of God and the Virgin Mary," the colonel shouted, struggling uselessly. "I just wanted to teach her a lesson. You can't do this to a lady." "The lady ordered the overseers to do this to my wife," Samuel said, looking directly into Mrs. Eleanor's terrified eyes. "Now you will feel on your own skin what you ordered for Sarah." "I am a lady," Mrs. Eleanor screamed hysterically. "I am a baron's daughter. You can't treat me like this." "Sarah was a lady too," Samuel replied with deadly calm. "She could read. She spoke beautifully. She was educated. But that didn't save her from you, in front of her bound husband and under the terrified eyes of the overseers. Samuel raped Mrs. Eleanor on the dining table, under the desperate eyes of the colonel, who screamed and tried to free himself from the ropes until he bled. "You thought I would forget," Samuel repeated methodically with every movement. "You thought a black man has no feelings, no dignity, no man's heart. Every action was calculated. Every movement had a purpose. It was not just violence. It was justice being applied in equal measure." When he was finished, Mrs. Eleanor was completely destroyed. Her body broken, her soul shattered, her gaze lost in the void. Exactly like Sarah 3 days before. "Now comes the best part of the show," Samuel announced, picking up the butcher knife he had brought from the kitchen. "What are you going to do?" the colonel asked, terrified, his voice a whisper. "Exactly what you did to me," Samuel replied with icy coldness. "You're going to watch the people you love die in front of you." Slowly. The first was Mrs. Eleanor. Samuel slit her throat slowly, staring into the colonel's eyes so that he wouldn't miss a single second of her agony. "This is how Sarah died," he said as the hot blood gushed out slowly, losing her life with every second. Feeling her soul escape, the colonel screamed like a mortally wounded animal. The love he felt for his wife turned into pure excruciating agony that seemed to tear his chest apart. "Eleanor, my dear Eleanor," he bellowed until his voice was. "Now you know exactly how I felt," Samuel said, wiping the knife on the dead woman's red dress. "It's terrible, isn't it?" John the Rogue tried to flee in a panic, but his legs wouldn't obey his brain's commands. The terror had paralyzed every muscle in his body. "Your turn has come," Samuel said, approaching like a predator. "Please, for the love of your children," John begged on his knees. "I have a family, a wife. Sarah was my entire family," Samuel cut him off mercilessly. "And you helped destroy her for fun." The knife entered between John the Rogue's ribs, slowly, finding his heart. But Samuel was in no hurry. He let the overseer bleed out gradually like a pig being bled in a slaughterhouse. "Does it hurt much?" Samuel asked with genuine curiosity. Sarah felt a lot of pain too. For 2 hours she felt pain. Peter the whip was desperately trying to crawl to the door, leaving a trail of urine on the floor. But Samuel stepped hard on his back. "Easy now, B. Not so fast," he said almost conversationally. "Your judgment isn't over yet." The knife methodically cut the tendons in Peter's legs, then his arms. The man slowly became a bleeding heap of flesh, unable to move. "Now you won't be running from anyone ever again," Samuel said with satisfaction. "Just like Sarah couldn't run from you." The colonel watched everything, powerless to do anything, just as Samuel had been forced to watch the systematic destruction of Sarah. "Why don't you just kill me at once?" William asked, his voice completely. "Because I'm not finished yet," Samuel replied methodically. "You still have to feel all the suffering you caused me down to the last ounce." Peter the whip took exactly 15 minutes to die. Samuel made sure it was slow, painful, conscious. "There," he finally said, wiping his bloody hands on a clean cloth. "Now all that's left is for you to complete the set." The colonel was completely psychologically destroyed. His wife dead, his overseers dead, his house turned into a bloody slaughterhouse. "Are you going to kill me too?" he asked without hope. "No," Samuel said, calmly untying the ropes. "You're going to live the rest of your life with this on your conscience, just like I would have had to live if I hadn't gotten my revenge." "How will I be able to live with this?" The colonel cried like a child. "The same way you thought I was going to live without Sarah," Samuel replied with relentless logic, and he walked out of the big house without any hurry, as if he were just finishing another day's work. He passed by the small grave where Sarah was buried under the mango tree. He knelt on the still fresh earth. "It's done, my love," he whispered, touching the earth. "The debt is paid. You can rest in peace now." Samuel disappeared into the impenetrable darkness of the Atlantic forest that surrounded the plantation like a protective cloak. He took only the clothes on his back, Sarah's ring in his pocket, and the absolute certainty that he had carried out the justice that the white man's laws never would. Behind him, he left a trail of blood and terror that would forever change the history of the region and the relationship between masters and slaves in the Mississippi Valley. Colonel William remained seated among the decomposing bodies until the sun had fully risen, staring at the dried blood that stained the French porcelain. His wife's red dress that had become a shroud, the lifeless eyes that silently accused him. "Eleanor," he murmured incessantly, touching his wife's cold face. "My dear Eleanor, forgive what we did." When the other slaves found the carnage on that bright Christmas morning, no one cried for the dead. There was only a heavy, respectful silence mixed with a relief they dared not show openly. "Samuel did what we all wanted to do," whispered Maria Conga, the oldest slave in the quarters. "He didn't just avenge Sarah," said another slave with restrained admiration. "He avenged all of us, all who died, all who suffered. Now they know they can die too." A third added that they bleed like common people. The colonel never reported the crime to the proper authorities. How could he explain that a slave had raped and murdered his wife in front of him? How could he publicly admit that he had completely lost control of his own plantation? The social shame was infinitely greater than the thirst for revenge. What exactly happened here? Asked the sheriff from Beaufort County, who came to investigate the persistent rumors of violence. Bandits, the colonel lied, avoiding the man's eyes. Outlaws broke into the house on Christmas Eve. They killed my wife and fled. And the slave Samuel, the sheriff insisted, consulting his notes. Where is he now? He fled during the confusion, William replied, unable to hold his gaze. He must have gotten scared and ran into the woods. But the real stories spread like wildfire through the slave quarters of the entire region. The slaves have their own sophisticated communication networks that work better than any newspaper. And the truth always finds a way to travel. Have you heard about Samuel from Beaufort? They would ask each other discreetly at the open-air markets. The one who took justice into his own hands, they would reply, their eyes shining. That's the one. He proved that even a slave has a limit, and when that limit is crossed, the legend grew exponentially with each retelling. In some versions, Samuel had killed 10 brutal overseers. In others, he had burned down the entire big house with the family inside. In more elaborate versions, the spirits had come down to help him in his revenge, but the emotional core always remained exactly the same. A man who had lost everything he loved in life and exacted a just price for the suffering inflicted upon him in the same cruel currency. 3 months after the bloody revenge, Colonel Williams sold the Beaufort plantation for a price far below market value. He could no longer sleep a single night in the house where he had lost his wife and witnessed his own cowardice. "I'm moving to the capital for good," he announced to the slaves gathered in the yard. "You will be sold to other masters in the region." No one seemed surprised by the decision. Everyone knew that after that Christmas night, nothing would ever be the same on the plantation or in the region. "What if the new master is even worse than this one?" an old female slave asked with genuine concern. "He can't be worse," Shyam replied, smiling for the first time in years. "Now they all know that we can fight back when they cross the line. They know they can die too." Another slave added, "that they're not immortal, as they thought." For decades on the plantations scattered throughout the Mississippi Valley, whenever a mistress ordered excessive abuse against female slaves, the captives would whisper among themselves, "Beware of Samuel from Beaufort." The name became a powerful symbol that even the most obedient and submissive slave had a human limit. Older, more experienced masters began to carefully instruct their new wives and teenage children. Never humiliate married slaves in front of their spouses. "Why not?" they would ask, not understanding. "Because there are things that are not forgiven," they would reply nervously, looking over their shoulders. "There are limits that cannot be crossed without consequences." The extraordinary story of Samuel reached as far as New Orleans, carried by merchants and travelers. In the circles of defiance, it became a song of resistance. In the secret spiritual gatherings, it became a powerful prayer for protection against oppressors. "Samuel, my protector," the defiant ones would sing. "Give me the strength to fight back when injustice hits too hard." Healers and root doctors began to invoke his name in special concoctions against oppressors and potions for courage. "Take this mixture with faith," they would say, to mistreated slaves seeking help. And always remember Samuel from Beaufort, who showed that every man has a sacred right to dignity. In 1865, when the 13th Amendment was finally ratified, many former slaves from all over the state made a pilgrimage to Beaufort County. They wanted to see for themselves the plantation where the first real revenge had taken place. It was here that one of us proved definitively that we were not cowards. An emotional old ferryman said, showing the place to his curious grandchildren. He proved that when injustice surpassed all limits of humanity, revenge came in the same cruel measure. Samuel was never found or captured. Some people solemnly swore to have seen him working in hidden maroon communities in the swamps. Others said he had become a respected healer in remote villages in the backwoods of Louisiana. The truth is that Samuel transformed into something much greater than an ordinary man. He became a symbol, a living legend, a concrete hope for justice. He's still out there, the slaves would say when facing impossible situations. And if the injustice goes beyond the human limit, he will return to collect. Sarah was buried under the century-old mango tree, where she liked to sit on hot afternoons. But after her husband's revenge, that tree became a sacred place of pilgrimage. Pregnant slaves would come to ask for divine protection for their children. Married men would ask for spiritual strength to defend their families. Holy woman Sarah, they would pray with devotion. Protect my family from the cruelty of wicked masters. The mango tree grew much larger than all the other trees in the region. Its fruits were the largest and sweetest anyone had ever tasted, as if Sarah's pure goodness still nourished the earth with love. Samuel was never found. He became a symbol, a spirit of vengeance, and the story was passed down through generations. A chilling reminder that there is a limit to human endurance, that when injustice becomes unbearable, the price of dignity can be blood. And that the name whispered in the dark was Samuel, the man who brought a brutal Christmas to the masters of Beaufort.